So today we're talking about selecting the right things to monitor. And while that could be a fairly broad topic, the points that we're going to talk about today is at a high level, what and why do we monitor? So we're going to have a refresher maybe for some of you, but also just kind of honing in on what are measures and metrics, and then talk briefly on goals and objectives. And then I'd like to move into the idea of making monitoring process centric. So we're going to talk about how we actually associate metrics and process as kind of the subject of monitoring, and then the ROI of the monitoring process. Because if you're going to, in the business world, talk about selecting the right thing, it is often has to be associated with an ROI consideration. So we'll talk about what ROI means in terms of monitoring. And I think, as Susan mentioned, maybe at the beginning, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. I'll also kind of try to leave pauses as we go to answer questions as they come in. So what and why do we monitor? Generally, we're monitoring data to inform action. And I can't stress this enough. There's really no point in monitoring anything in business if it's not to inform some sort of action. So starting with that premise and anchoring in your mind the general point of monitoring is good for the discussion, but also just going forward if you're in the space where you need to be organizing any sort of monitoring efforts. And the data that we look to monitor typically is results. So this could be after the fact, after a process is run or after a project is completed. You're looking at the resulting information. Operating measures, that's a pretty encompassing category, but to me, I'm trying to articulate you're monitoring live data about a process as it's happening. So, that could be having a thermometer in something, that could be just measuring the speed, the cycle time, and we'll talk about this more, but it's kind of the difference between a post facto measurement versus a live measurement. And then there's the operating metrics, which you can monitor, and that's not really a measure. And again, we'll talk about this in a moment, but metrics are analyzing various measures in combination to kind of look at different pieces and parts of how the process is performing. And then we monitor these by checking progress against plans in order to steer decision-making and learning processes. So the idea of you collect this data and the informing of action being more specific, you're always usually trying to inform a learning process for intelligent automation, trying to inform what do we do next to kind of improve this process. And that kind of that sort of theme of what action should be happening, what processes should be taking that monitoring data and transforming it into value is the why part of monitoring. And then that's going to depend on what you select for monitoring, and that will be what we talk about in a moment. So I had a question come in. Shouldn't monitoring also be done in some form as required by the definition of a control structure by COSO? So if you have a risk framework like a COSO, or if you have any sort of regulatory compliance or certification framework, monitoring can be done by that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So the question, shouldn't it also be done in some form? I guess Andy, the question, you can type in a response to, do you mean should it always be done in some sort of form or framework? Because certainly if that's part of your organization, then monitoring should be considered within those boundaries, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be general just for business improvement or general business best practice. If anything, I would recommend generally, if you have a risk framework or you have a compliance framework in place, it should really, business optimization should always come first for monitoring, because those, after all, a lot of it is the point of these frameworks to either minimize the risk in the company or for the supply chain or for the consumer. So, but you should always be kind of optimizing your business structures first, and then considering regulatory compliance frameworks as a second, and then try to harmonize those things together in terms of what is the right thing to monitor. So as we go through, we can talk more about that if you have any follow-ups there. All right. So measures versus metrics. A lot of times in business, I think it's important to start here for just a minute because people conflate these two. They're always saying measures and metrics, or they use them interchangeably. But measures and metrics, they should be aligned with process activities first. We should always be aligned with an operating context. But the difference between the two is a measure is derived by taking a measurement. Again, fundamental, but it helps to separate. So this would be a primary data source. This would be a live sample from something that's happening in the physical environment. And this is when we talk about measuring a process. A lot of times today, we're talking about digital service processes. So it becomes a little less tethered to the tactile world, which is why I think people forget what these things mean at their root. But a measure in a digital service process would be what are the actual keystrokes or the time it takes to complete a task on the computer or time it takes to complete a phone call. But these are actual live measures in the environment. Whereas a metric is typically a calculation between measures and, most commonly a form of division. And these are what we use in business to try to derive efficiency, productivity, effectiveness, quality. It's how we measure things over time typically, or how we build trend data, how we build comparative data. But metrics are always going to be derived from measures. And the measures always have to be derived from something happening in the physical environment. So that's part of the story to kind of keep our infrastructure aligned about if we're going to monitor something, it always has to be tying back to monitoring some physical activity that's going on in the environment. And what we're monitoring, we're trying to typically monitor measures and their associated metrics that associate with our business goals and their, I guess, derivative objectives. And before I throw goals and objectives around, let's just take 30 seconds to refresh what these are, because again, I find that these get muddied a lot now and they're used interchangeably. But a goal is often higher level and it doesn't necessarily have to be quantified. And you don't really monitor to goals if you're monitoring effectively, because goals are really talking about strategic objectives, not strategic objectives. Let me use my words carefully. Strategic direction, broad strategic, I guess, now I'm trying to not use the word objective like everyone does, and I'm getting gummed up. So a goal is just a group of objectives. Objectives are the actual metrics and measures that can be validated, the success criteria. So a goal, and you can see here in this chart, it's higher level and it sets a direction, or it tells you broadly what you want to get done using softer terms. And then objectives could be, you can have multiple objectives that when they're all hit, it actually means that goal is completed. You can have a single goal and a single measurable objective, but the objectives are the part that actually have hard measures associated with them. They actually have data. So when you're talking about monitoring, you're monitoring a process, and usually you want to tie that to an objective, because otherwise it could be a goal that happens on a quarterly basis or a one-time basis, or it could be an ongoing goal, but that goal always has to be broken down into the objectives that it's comprised of. So from there, when we talk about making monitoring process-centric, you want to think about the logic of there's always going to be a target process that is the subject of the monitoring. And then every process itself has a goal of value creation. So I'm going to pause here for a second, because I'm making sort of broad statements, but they're always going to hold true universally in the environment. And this will help structure what you're talking about when somebody's asking you to either create a monitoring program or monitor what's going on. And I'll talk about compliance again in a moment, because there's always going to be a target process, and that process itself always has to have a goal, because otherwise the process wouldn't be there. And it's for us to understand what that goal is of a given process, if that's the process that's going to be monitored, and what the scope is of that process, and what that goal is trying to create, what that process is trying to create from a value perspective. And then monitoring should be tied to that process scope, and the metrics relate to the ability to create value. And again, a process creating value, if you took 100 processes, they could have 100 different value props and could use different measures and associated metrics every single time. So it's not trying to simplify this to the point where, you're going to be using the same measures and metrics every time, but it's this logic of what is the target process? What is that process trying to accomplish? And then tying your metrics to what, like very tactically, to what it is trying to accomplish. And since Andy brought it up earlier, I'll say again, compliance is not that different. It's just one extra layer of complexity. So if you have a framework that you're basically being audited against, or you're internally auditing against, the monitoring still needs to start with the same. It could be your entire company is subject to the audit. It could be just a certain subset of processes that's subject to the audit. But whatever it is, you're still defining your scope. And then the process's goal at that point, one of the goals of the process is to maintain compliance under whatever audit framework you're being subject to. So that just adds to the goal of the process, but you could think about it that way. So if I'm picking a target scope process and then I'm defining the goals of that process, whatever its actual value producing goal from a business perspective is then just going to be supplemented with its goal to remain compliant under any sort of external frameworks. And then that all ties together to the minimum group you really want of measures and metrics that you would apply to that particular process to then have as your scope of monitoring. So if you can follow my narrative there about how you're kind of always thinking process first and then goal of process, there is some level of universality to the measures and metrics that you'd be looking for, because every process, whether it's tangible, whether it's digital, it always runs on these same kind of fundamental measures that are going to help you describe how a process is behaving. So when I say it starts with the process, when you see here, having an accurate process visualization or process data is going to be critical to baselining, measuring, and analyzing processes. And that includes monitoring is a huge part of that. Because once you can figure out how to measure your process, then you can be managed or changed or improved. So when you look at here, this is a very generic flow diagram where you just have activities and you have roles. It's a typical swim lane diagram. But what I've just superimposed here is just a few things to show that it doesn't matter what I even put in the boxes. It could be any company, any industry. Everything is subject to the same physicality because we have humans who are working in the real world, who are executing these processes. So you're going to have resource costs, you're going to have cycle time, you're going to have wait time, you're going to have the cost of poor quality, you're going to have machine technology costs, human resource costs. It's all going to be in this realm, and it's just a matter of picking what is relevant for the particular monitoring objective that you have is how you're going to tie these things together. So the universal process measures, it's always going to be, if you've heard the cheaper, faster, better type of triangle or the cost, speed, quality, it's what we're talking about here. But it's good to be reminded that it's always, no matter what you're doing, it's going to be lumped this way. So I just kind of reorganized some of the universal measures from the last page over here, so you can kind of see, you should always, if you're thinking about creating what are the right things to monitor, you're creating a monitoring program, it's always starting here. It doesn't matter where you are. It's okay, what elements or dimensions of the process matter. And then, of course, we talk about metrics, and metrics are typically the more effective thing to monitor than just raw measures. And metrics are just, again, like we mentioned earlier, the combination of measures. And if you think about, okay, what is the combination of these universal process measures that we just reviewed in brief? It's going to be a lot of times process ROI, which is what is the cost going in versus the value of the outputs. What is the efficiency of the process, which is the ROI that over a particular time period or compared to the previous time period. And these are these in the slide on the green. These are just kind of very common when you start to take your measures and combine them into universal metrics. And then the process effectiveness, like what is the actual quality of the outputs over the cost. So these are elements of the process that are going to be the same no matter what kind of process you have. And this can also be really great targets to start, a basic monitoring program. Because what else would you want to monitor except for how a process is performing? Because every business is just going to be the outputs of its collective processes. And then one thing, I'll mention here too, an efficient process does not always produce a good product. And that's why some of these things, when you think about whether it's quality or it's the speed or it's the ROI, you've got to then, this is where we start to say, okay, all these things are universal. Well, you've got to pick the right ones to tell your story. And then we'll get back to the point where monitoring has to also inform action. So what is the action you're trying to inform, and what is the ROI there? And that's going to be bringing this whole narrative together, more or less. And you'll see here, cost also includes penalties and risk associated with non-compliance. And this comes back to that idea of, are we using a framework? So a lot of times when you think about a process metric, it's one that people don't usually associate, oh, how is the compliance regulatory aspect something that a process is managing? But a process, even if you take regulatory compliance concerns out of your considerations, a process is going to always be accumulating risk over time. So let's say it has people who are burning out, or machines that are getting toward the end of their life cycle. As a process runs over and over and over, it's passively accumulating process risk in various forms. And if you think about the likelihood of one of those risks occurring because you're not maintaining the process, you're not training your people, you're not swapping parts and things out, you're not upgrading your software, that risk can materialize in material costs for the business. The same logic applies to regulatory compliance. If your process is running in a way over time that the chance of you being audited and having a negative audit result, or you going out of compliance, or you not fulfilling the needs of your frameworks, as that increases over time because you're not controlling the process, that's just an accumulation of process risk. And risk is nothing more than a calculation of likely cost. So I always, think back to the insurance industry where risk is defined. I'm pretty sure this is actually even outside of insurance. Risk is just the cost associated with a negative event occurring times the probability of that event occurring. So when you think about managing risk always has a cost, and like every other process cost, it's just coming up over time. So a lot of times when you're managing regulatory compliance, it doesn't have to be this huge outside consideration, like, oh, I have to monitor this separately, or I have to monitor this differently. You want to use these same fundamentals I'm explaining here in terms of measuring and managing processes, and you just want to integrate whatever risk and compliance requirements you're subject to into that way of thinking so that you can reduce your risk associated with costs in that area. Because getting audited and having $1 million or $10 million fine, or getting audited, failing GDPR and having a massive fine there, that's just cost, just like anything else in the process. Cost of poor quality, but also cost of risk. All right, so now we move on to selecting the right metrics, because I've spent a good amount of time now. What are measures? How do we think about it from a process perspective? So the order of events here is, what is the process? That's always first. And what are the process objectives for value creation? So what are the actual measurable or quantifiable elements of the process that shows that it's creating the value that it's meant to be creating? And then what type of, and that's right. So then you're picking which metrics associate with that value creation directly. So, if your process is meant to be making lemonade, it's like, how do you actually tie the right metrics to show that the lemonade is being produced in the right way? Or if you're a bank and you're creating loans as your service, what are the actual metrics now that it's less tangible? What are the numbers? What are the measures that I'm putting together to show that that is happening the right way? And then the other part is, once you get the process outlined and the value and the metrics that actually associate with the value, then you've got to consider the ROI of the monitoring itself. And this is the part where you could, in a vacuum, identify all the right measures, identify the metrics, but then you have to understand that the measuring of those things has costs, especially in the digital space. A lot of times your measuring is going to come from software solution or software automation. And a lot of times now, software applications and SaaS products, they have a lot of this workflow data collection built in, which is getting really nice, especially in the last 10 years. People are getting a lot better at that. But otherwise, you have to configure it yourself, or you have to supplement whatever you're doing with monitoring software. In some industries, let's say customer service, you might be adding additional software that's logging keystrokes, or a workflow monitoring or measuring engine that supplements whatever software products you're using. But whatever it is, you've got a cost there. You've got a cost of maintaining your measuring solution, your instruments. You've got a cost of configuring. You've got resources to do those things. And generally, anytime you're adding on to process for the sake of, you're going to be adding cost. So you have to think about when I'm like, monitoring is not free. So the first thing you have to consider is, what is the cost of the monitoring or the measuring? And then the monitoring itself, again, measuring and monitoring, the cost of, picking the right metrics and yielding the right information. You could have a lot of monitoring activity and you could be paying for it. And if you haven't selected the right things and it doesn't inform any action, even if you do select the right things and it doesn't inform action, then it's just a cost. It doesn't actually ever translate to anything. Because the last part is you take the monitoring data and you translate it into action. And the only way you can translate it into action is usually it's process improvement. So what I mean by that is, if I'm monitoring a process, the idea is that if the monitoring produces data that either violates my control limits, or it just generally tells me that I'm out of compliance, or that my process is not performing correctly, or that my process needs some sort of help, you have to have a process built off the monitoring that takes that information and then starts acting on it effectively. Because if you can't translate that action into an actual process change or process improvement or some sort of action, then you're not going to materialize any benefits from the monitoring. And then there's no point really in doing it at all. So again, if you think about it from a compliance perspective, even if your entire goal is to be within your audit requirements, that could be that. The monitoring should show you that you're not. It should show you why you're not, and it should inform action that helps you get back into compliance. Because if you can't complete that feedback loop, then there's no point. So the ROI here is, when you look down at the bottom, the benefit produced with the outcomes of the monitoring has to offset the cost of the measuring and the monitoring. And again, the measuring, I'm separating because you put in the instruments to actually take raw measures, and then the monitoring is interpreting that or condensing it into metrics that actually highlight what the process is doing accurately. So if your cost of measuring, your cost of monitoring over time and interpreting that monitoring data into something actionable, if those costs don't offset or eclipse the benefit, or I'm sorry, if the benefit does not offset or compensate for the cost, then you have negative value for the monitoring. So I know, in a short 30 minutes, we don't have a lot of time to go into the detail of, okay, how do I really get into the right exact metrics, because that can be pretty lengthy. But I just wanted to give you all an overall impression of the ROI that you need to be considering here is, what am I measuring? How am I monitoring? And how's the cost of those things? Because that is actually part of the equation of selecting the right things to monitor. Because you can't select the right things to monitor divorced of the cost and the process around the measuring and the monitoring of those things. Because if you do, and you don't finish the process thinking of how am I going to take that monitoring data and make something of it, then the ROI is going to be negative, and your monitoring, you wouldn't have selected the right things to monitor in that case. So at a high level, the right thing you want to monitor is really metrics, and it's process metrics specifically. And I know that covers everything, so I feel like I'm kind of cheating you a little bit, but we don't have in 30 minutes of time to really talk about how do I look at any given process and select the exact right metrics that associate with value creation. But that's the idea you want to be bringing into your conversations. And then again, the metrics have to be associated. We've gone over that quite a bit now. And the idea is, if your metrics that you're picking don't directly correlate to what the process is doing, or reducing some sort of cost or risk component of the process, then it's probably not going to be anything that the monitoring can translate into action effectively. Because this last point we just went over is, selecting the right metrics necessarily involves the cost and the understanding the result and making sure that you're safeguarding there's ROI on the activity overall. So that's the summary of the points I wanted to make. And as always, we've left 2 or 3 minutes here for additional questions, follow-up questions, and I'm willing to get into any topic in more detail if anyone has any questions.
So would you process metrics equals process KPIs?
Yeah, so it could or it could not. And again, this is where process KPIs, if they're done correctly, those very well could be your same metrics for monitoring, but I would be careful to make that assumption, because KPIs are, just like we were talking about in this presentation, they have to be consciously selected by somebody who's saying that these performance indicators actually equate to what, like, helping us understand what the process is trying to accomplish. So if they've done a good job of that, and the point of your monitoring, the objective of your monitoring program is to inform action to support whether the process is running effectively, then all those things will line up. But to Andy, your question earlier, you could be told, hey, your objective is to create a monitoring program to make sure that you're within COSO or some other regulatory framework. And the KPIs could be linked to completely performance-based indicators of the process, and they're not comprehensive of considering compliance and regulatory dimensions. And then the KPIs won't match the process metrics that you're looking for measurement, for monitoring at all. So monitoring has its own objectives. KPIs, there also might be serving leadership or have their own objectives. So we're all talking about KPIs are nothing more than metrics. So yes, they equal process metrics, but I'm just trying to be very careful about saying they might not necessarily equal the metrics you want to be using for monitoring, because they may have different goals and objectives.
Sam, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us today and presenting.
Thank you, everybody.